Obsidian Spears, the last breakwater. Planet Gault. Segmentum Pacificus. Day 43 of Tyranid invasion. The rain fell in punishing sheets, a cold, unending deluge that did nothing to cleanse the battlefield of its foul scent. It was a miserable cocktail of ozone from spent last cells, the coppery tang of Imperial blood, and the cloying, sickly sweet reek of Tyranid ichor. The remnants of the 143rd Cadian shock troops were pressed back against the churning surf of the Amaranthine Ocean, their backs to the endless waves. Their designated last stand, codenamed Point Bellerophon, was the final defensible terrain before the Zenus tide could simply pour off the continental shelf. They were a shattered shield, their line bending, if not yet broken, their ammunition nearly spent. The last message from High Command had been a vox-static-laden whisper, a chilling rumor passed from officer to officer. The High Lords had given the grim final order. If the line broke, the planet would be subject to exterminatus. Sergeant Corvinus, his face a bruised and exhausted mask, roared orders over the roar of the surf. By squads, deliberate rate of fire, remember your arcs, don't waste the cells. His platoon, what was left of it, had dug shallow fighting positions with entrenching tools and stacked sandbags and debris as hasty cover. Their last vestiges of training held them together. They fired in staggered volleys, the staggered red light of their laser guns punching into the oncoming swarm, trying to keep a semblance of fire discipline. This was defilade, a desperate attempt to gain cover from the chittering tide. Lima 4 Delta, this is Lima 0, shift fire 2 o'clock, came a clipped voice over the comms, instantly answered by a cascade of laser gun fire. Bounding back to phase line Ashfall, another voice rasped, the words half drowned by the storm. Corporal Theron, fall back, bounding overwatch, Corvinus yelled. Theron's fire team, 4 men strong, would lay down suppressing fire, while the next team fell back a few meters. It was an eons-old infantry fallback drill, a testament to their ingrained discipline. But against a foe that consumed its dead for biomass, it was a delaying tactic, not a salvation. It was also exhausting for the soldiers, sprinting and dropping, sprinting and dropping. Suddenly a voice, staticky and desperate, broke through the comms. All remaining Imperial forces on Gault, this is High Command. Be advised, Astartes support is en route to your sector. I repeat, Astartes support is coming. The message ended with a crackle of static, leaving the men with a sliver of hope. Then, a flicker of light tore through the bruised heavens, followed by another and another. Dozens of them, the unmistakable fiery trails of Space Marine drop pods. A roar went up from the exhausted Cadians, a last surge of desperate joy. By the throne they're here, the Emperor's angels, someone shouted. But the joy died on their lips as the pods did the unthinkable. They plunged straight into the churning, storm-tossed waves of the Amaranthine. The hissing impact was followed by a series of deep, thunderous booms. The Cadians on the beach felt it through their boots, an ominous rumble that felt like the seabed itself was growling. Then, silence. A deafening, absolute silence save for the crashing waves and the chittering of the approaching Tyranids. A low groan of despair rippled through the ranks, quickly replaced by a wave of cynical black humor. Well, there goes our ride, muttered Corporal Theron, a manic, bitter laugh on his lips. They missed the land. Didn't think their officers went to the same academy ours did. Even if they did make it, what's the point? A gaunt-faced private murmured, his voice hollow. Fleet's gonna burn us anyway. We've got a few hours left before the whole world is ash. The comment hung in the air, a cold, sober reminder of their impending doom. Oh, Holy Throne, thanks for that, Major Buzzkill, snapped Theron. Silence, you craven dogs, a voice boomed, cutting through the morbid jokes. Commissar Valerius, a rigid, unyielding figure in his black greatcoat, strode to the front of the line. He had been a constant, unblinking presence, an unbending symbol of implacable faith. He leveled a burning stare at the joking guardsman. "Your jests are an insult to the Emperor's chosen. The Emperor has a plan. He has brought us to this final stand not for some ignoble rescue, but for a glorious, sanctified death. Do not pray for deliverance. Pray for the strength to sell your lives for the Imperium. This is our glorious end, and it will be one for the history books." Corvinus couldn't help but wonder who would be writing that history. Just as Commissar Valerius was raising his plasma pistol, a dark promise on his lips, the ocean began to move. Not with the frantic chaos of the storm, but with a deliberate, unnatural fury. A low thrum vibrated through the Cadians' boots and through their very bones. The water parted as if swept aside by an unseen hand, and then from the depths they rose. First one, then another, then dozens more. Black armored forms, slick and menacing, burst from the surface of the sea, water sluicing off their polished ceramite like mercury. They weren't walking on the waves, they were rising from them, propelled by powerful hydrojet-equipped jump packs that had been activated underwater. But the last to emerge was different. It was a massive, boxy shape, a walking tomb, its hull pitted and scarred by millennia of war. It was a dreadnought, and it rose from the depths with an ominous hiss of displaced water, its heavy flamer and power fist dripping with brine. They were the Obsidian Spears, and they had not missed. They had chosen this entry point, their natural domain, to apply shock and awe doctrine, and from their vox speakers came a ferocious chant. Kamati, Kamati, Kura Kura. As the first Astartes warrior, a giant with a gleaming obsidian spear, stepped onto the beach, Corporal Theron, utterly unable to help himself, leaned over and muttered to Private Kalen, "Look at that! Didn't even take the stairs. Talk about making a theatrical entrance. Who needs a thunderhawk when you can rise from the sea?" The comment, a bitter joke aimed at the universe itself, was uttered just loudly enough for the Astartes to hear. The huge dreadnought stomped past with a slow, deliberate motion. His vox grill hummed. "Theatricality is a distraction, guardsman. Your foes fear what they cannot comprehend. The shock of an unexpected assault is more valuable than the glory of a planned one." The voice was a cold, emotionless bass, and Theron felt a chill that had nothing to do with the driving rain. "But yes, otherwise you are correct," the giant continued. "Captain Kowata does like to make an entrance. Tene tene tangata pururo." A hulking carnifex, its bone blades slick with the gore of a dozen Cadians, let out a piercing screech and charged the lad space marine. The Astartes, with a fluid grace that belied his massive form, dodged the clumsy attack. He held a gleaming spear, its head crafted from the same dark volcanic glass as the weapons of their homeworld. It was a work of brutal art. He lunged, and the spear became a blur of motion, a flashing streak of black and light that tore through the Tyranid vanguard. The spear pierced the carnifex's thick carapace as if it were air, shearing through bone and muscle with contemptuous ease. The Xenos beast collapsed in a silent, twitching heap. "Tenara, Ka-ora." The Obsidian Spears hit the beach like a tempest. They were a living manifestation of violence of action, their jump packs used for rapid flanking and cutting through swarm concentrations like a precision strike. They were force multipliers, a small number of warriors turning the tide of a battle. And in their midst was Dreadnought Tahu, a living fortress, his heavy flamer washing over waves of termagants and hormagaunts, reducing them to crispy, chittering husks. The Cadians, who had been pushed to their breaking point, found a renewed strength. They were no longer the hunted, they were the mop-up crew. As the spears carved a bloody path, the guard poured fire into the gaps they created. The ground began to shake, not from the nearby battle, but from a deeper, more profound source. Lances of golden light stabbed down from orbit, screaming past the clouds and vaporizing entire Tyranid concentrations in silent, searing flashes. The air was split by the roar of screaming engines as Imperial Navy Thunderbolt fighters, flying so low they were almost skimming the treetops, dropped their payloads on the encroaching swarm. The Imperial fleet was providing orbital fire support and airstrikes, a final desperate push to clear a path for the evacuation. After the initial chaotic fight, the Spears consolidated their position. Sergeant Corvinus and his men began dragging the wounded to makeshift casualty collection points behind the shallow fighting positions. Medics began battlefield triage under fire, a grisly ballet of tourniquets, painkillers and the Emperor's mercy. Other guardsmen, their faces grim, knelt beside the freshly killed, not to mourn, but to strip the bodies of usable lasgun power packs and spare ammunition clips. It was a silent, unsentimental ritual of necessity. Corvinus saw a young guardsman, Private Rylan, sobbing over the still form of his comrade. Rylan refused to move, his eyes locked on a wound that had shattered his friend's femur, a messy, gruesome ruin that no battlefield medkit could ever fix. The medic, his face a grim mask, shook his head. "It's over, son, he's not coming back." With a weary sigh, the medic unsheathed a needle and, without hesitation, administered a final fatal dose of Emperor's mercy. It was a silent, grim act of charity, a quiet goodbye to a pain-racked soul. Corvinus, his body screaming with exhaustion, stumbled towards the nearest space marine. The Astartes stood over the twitching corpse of a lictor. Corvinus, his courage bolstered by a desperate need for answers, rasped, "Thank you, my lord, but why? Why the sea?" The space marine turned, his helmet's vox grill a red glow in the gloom. The voice was a deep, resonant bass devoid of emotion. The Tyranids expected a strike from the sky. They did not expect a hunter to rise from the depths. Tactical advantage is a factor of surprise. The Astartes raised a massive hand and pointed inland. "Gather your men. You will now form a new line and advance." Another space marine, a veteran sergeant with the skull and laurel symbol on his shoulder, came to a halt directly in front of Commissar Valerius. Valerius, having finally regained his composure, puffed out his chest. "Space Marine, your arrival is a testament to the Emperor's will. This regiment was prepared to offer its last breath for him." He gestured to the bloody carnage. They were ready to embrace glorious martyrdom. The ground rumbled as Dreadnought Tahu moved between them, his synthesized voice a deep, hollow rumble that seemed to come from the very earth itself. "Silence, child. Your concept of glory is a foolish one." The Dreadnought's optical sensors, glowing with an ancient patient light, focused on the Commissar. "I have fought wars on 1,000 worlds. I have stood as the last line on dying stars. I have seen countless mortals like you mistake sacrifice for purpose." His voice, a hollow rumble, seemed to echo with the weight of centuries. To die is simple. To live is the struggle. This regiment's courage is found not in its readiness to be consumed, but in its will to endure. Do not confuse zeal for purpose. The Emperor requires survivors, not monuments. Valerius stiffened. "They are merely tools, nothing more. Their souls belong to the Emperor, and it is by his will if he chooses to take them. Until then, their bodies are valuable resources," Kalis interrupted, his voice a low, unshakable rumble. "There is no glory in dying when you can live to fight another day. Your zealous fervor would have seen valuable assets lost for no gain. We do not mourn the dead. We salvage the survivors." The words were a calculated mockery, a brutal, logical dismantling of the Commissar's entire philosophy. Valerius's face flushed with a mixture of fury and shock, a sight that was both terrifying and pathetically human. Theron, seeing his chance, whispered to Corvinus, "Looks like the sermon got cancelled. Guess he's not ready to die for the cause after all." Corvinus, unable to stifle a small, choked laugh, simply nodded. With the brief but pointed exchange concluded, Sergeant Kalis raised his gauntleted hand and pointed inland. "The Tyranid tide is breaking, but the main wave is half a day away. We will push the line, and secure a landing zone. Your regiment will follow. The advance began again, a more coordinated effort this time. For several long, brutal hours, the Cadians and the Spears fought a running campaign. The terrain changed from a coastal beach to a ruined urban landscape, then to a jagged, rocky plateau. Private Elias, a member of Theron's fire team, was taken by a burrowing Morlock as they fought through the ruins of a collapsed hab block. They never recovered his body. The men fought on, fueled by a new, desperate hope. At one point, as they leapfrogged across a bombed-out street, Theron turned to the Space Marine accompanying his team, a warrior named Thricus. "Doesn't your armor ever get heavy and wet? All this running and fighting, it's got to be miserable." Thricus, his black helmet still dripping with rain, didn't turn his head, although Corvinus almost felt the eyes rolling behind the teal eye lenses of his helmet. "To endure is to survive, guardsman. The spear that strikes unseen strikes truest." His words, part scripture, part tactical observation, were spoken with a complete lack of irony. Another Astartes, standing nearby, added in a dry, clipped voice, "Besides, our armor has a self-drying function. It is a feature you will not find on your flak armor. It is also rated for deep sea pressure." The last part was spoken with a hint of laconic pride, a subtle but distinct mockery of their absurd aquatic arrival. The Cadians shared a few more chuckles, a bitter but cathartic sound in the midst of the horror. Even the Commissar seemed to have lost his fire. Corvinus realized that Valerius had ignored or simply not seen transgressions that not long ago would have resulted in summary execution. He marched in silence, his rigid spine now a weary burden, his eyes fixed on the backs of the Astartes, who had so contemptuously shattered his belief in glorious death. Finally, they reached a flat, open expanse of rock. Sergeant Kalis, his Auspex readings confirming their location, designated the perimeter sectors. Squads 1 through 4, you have the south and west. Squads 5 through 7, your sectors are north and east. We will take the most exposed arcs. He then ordered a Cadian to mark the landing zone. A flare was fired despite the storm, its red smoke a desperate beacon in the gloom, a classic Navy evac doctrine procedure. Corvinus saw all the Marines' heads snap to the west simultaneously. He followed their gaze and saw that the horizon was moving. The Tyranids' mass swarm was here, and the chittering and thunder of their charge started to fill the air. Kalis touched a hand to the side of his helmet. "Navy evac Sierra 3-4, this is Spear 4. Ready for collection, marking with red smoke, hot LZ." Moments later, the Arvus lighters and dropships descended, their landing struts hissing as they touched down on the newly secured ground. The ramps lowered, and a wave of hope swept through the Cadians. The Spears were forming into their squads again, ready to fight as units rather than supporting the Cadian remnants. The air filled with the roar of incoming fire as gunships and orbital strikes began to punch large holes in the swarm, but these filled rapidly. Soon the Spears were firing their weapons continuously, knocking the beasts down in droves. Sergeant Corvinus watched as the dropships began to fill. Wounded soldiers were carefully but hurriedly loaded, followed by the rest of the surviving regiment, coming aboard on the run. He was one of the last to board, his eyes fixed on the black-armored forms of their saviors. The Obsidian Spears were not boarding. They were holding the line, their backs to the chaos of the evacuation. Bolts hurtled into the oncoming swarm of Tyranids, bringing them down by the dozen. As the last dropship began to lift off, Corvinus saw Sergeant Kalis raise his gauntleted hand, not in a farewell, but to check a display on his wrist. Corvinus leaned closer, glimpsing the small Auspex screen. It was a strategic overlay of the planet, and it showed not just the Tyranid tide on the coast, but other larger Xenos concentrations offshore, hidden in the abyssal trenches. Kalis saw him looking. "The Emperor protects," he rumbled over the Vox. his voice a low final bass. With a single powerful kick of his jump pack, he launched himself backwards towards the sea. The others followed, a flight of black meteors streaking through the rainy sky. Commissar Valerius stood in the dropship bay, his greatcoat soaked, his plasma pistol clutched in a white-knuckled grip. His face, a mask of profound confusion, watched as the Obsidian Spears plunged back into the sea. His worldview, based on glorious sacrifice, had been broken by their pragmatic, efficient heroism. Corvinus knew their mission wasn't over. He looked up, and in the distance he saw new shapes in the sky. Massive predatory forms, their engines roaring like thunder. They were Thunderhawks, the mighty gunships of the Astartes. He saw the Obsidian Spears rise from the water once more, but this time they didn't continue inland. They ascended directly towards the hovering Thunderhawks, their jump packs providing the final boost needed to reach the open loading bays. One by one they were recovered, the black armored figures disappearing into the bellies of the gunships. All but one. A final smaller Thunderhawk descended, its landing gear retracting as it hovered just above the waves. From its open belly, a recovery crane descended, a heavy magnetized winch at its end. The cable latched onto the dreadnought Tahu. He was pulled from the churning waves, water sluicing off his scarred hull as he was carefully winched into the Thunderhawk's hold. A final, hollow voice crackled over the Vox, a faint, final command. The survivors are secured. We will now resume our hunt. The dropship carrying the last of the 143rd Chaldean shock troops climbed higher, finally breaking through the heavy cloud cover into the silent void of space. Corvinus watched as the planet of Gault, a world he had fought and bled on for months, receded below them. But as the clouds parted, he saw it. Bright, fiery wounds blossomed on the planet's surface as the first orbital lances from the Imperial fleet began their terrible work. The exterminatus had begun. Corvinus watched the dying world, a profound hollowness settling in his gut. They had not been saved. They had been salvaged. He realized the spears had not come for glory or even to rescue them, but to retrieve valuable assets from a dying world. They had simply done their duty, a cold and unyielding purpose that saw men not as heroes, but as resources to be preserved. They were not monuments. They were survivors, and that was all. It was not a heroic end, but a grim continuation of their war, just on another battlefield. His heart did not swell with pride or renewed purpose. It simply grew heavy with the knowledge of his fate. To fight, to endure, to be a tool for the Imperium until the end. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe if you have enjoyed this story.